The worst of it was, we had no answer to this German supremacy. We only had our few Hurricanes and Fulmars left, and in fact I think most of them were out of commission by this time. And the guns, we fired our guns until they were red hot. We brought down a few planes, but really nothing. What we needed, and needed desperately, was fighter planes. The new fighter planes, Spitfires. This is what we really needed, Spitfires. Well, people at home, the higher up, must have realised this, because the aircraft carrier Eagle set out from Great Britain with a load of Spitfires bound for Malta. They sailed into the Mediterranean and sailed as near Malta as they possibly could. The German aircraft, of course, saw them and they bombed them and gave them a really rough time, but lots of these Spitfires got off the aircraft Eagle and made for Malta. They had only enough fuel aboard to take them to Malta, and no guns. They were flying as light as they possibly could. No ammunition, no nothing. They had guns but no ammunition, and just enough fuel, as I said, to take them to Malta. Now I remember I was on a day's leave that day, and I was down in Valletta when a truck stopped. A couple of red caps, that's the military police, said, "Sergeant, we need you." I was a sergeant by then. "We need you to go to Lucca right away." And they went round the streets and they rounded up all the soldiers and sailors, aye, and tinkers and tailors if they could have got them, and took us all to Lucca Aerodrome, where we had to help the poor overworked airmen to put ammunition into these Spitfires as they arrived. The German fighter planes were over Lucca Aerodrome shooting at these Spitfires. They were defenceless as they were coming in because, as I say, they had no ammunition. They couldn't do a thing except try and land. And whenever they touched down, they were filled up with fuel, they were filled up with ammunition, and these lads, heroes, one and all, up in there again to help to ward off the German aircraft to let the rest of the Spitfires come in. And as I say, there was fighter planes firing at these Spitfires. There was the newly arrived Spitfires which had been loaded up with fuel and ammunition firing at these German aircraft. There were bombers over bombing the aerodrome to stop these fighters from taking off. My goodness gracious me, what a day it was. However, the day ended, and when it had done, there we were with Spitfires, something we'd never had before. I don't know how many we had, but we had Spitfires. I don't know how many Spitfires were lost that day, but I do know that we must have lost an awful lot, because I had a younger brother aboard the aircraft carrier Eagle, and what he did was he gave quite a number of pilots who were taking off for Malta little notes, letters, and packets of cigarettes and my address, so that when or if they got to Malta, they would pass these letters and cigarettes along to me. He told me later that he gave about 8 letters and cigarettes to various pilots. I never received any. To me, this showed that these 8 pilots never made Malta. Now that we had Spitfires, I think we expected too much. We expected the Spitfires to wipe the German aircraft out of the sky. They didn't, because our German friends were no fools. What they did, they sent in more aircraft against us. And more, and still more, so that our Spitfires seemed very, very few in number in comparison to the clouds of aircraft that used to come over twice, 3 times a day, bombing the aerodromes, so that the poor airmen seemed to spend all day, every day, filling in bomb craters on the runways, and bombing the Grand Harbour, so there was no chance of any boats ever getting near to Malta. Now, this obviously had an effect. The fact that no boats were getting in had an effect on our food. Our food was beginning to run short. Our ammunition was beginning to run short. Our planes were not being replenished, nor were spare parts coming in for the planes, so that the number of Spitfires we were able to put up against the German onslaught became fewer and fewer. And instead of our having supremacy, I think our conditions were even worse. In peacetime, the Grand Harbour at Malta was a very, very important place for the Navy, because it had workshops where naval vessels could come in for repair, etc. Now, these workshops were slowly but surely getting smashed to smithereens under the weight of the German bombing. And we had quite a few ships out in the Mediterranean in difficulties, needing repair, and one in particular came limping in one day, HMS Penelope. She was covered in holes, and she limped into the Grand Harbour at Malta, hoping, I think, to get some sort of repairs done. No facilities for doing repairs. So what they had to do was, they got all these holes, and they got wood, and they hammered wood into all these holes. Now, when I was a wee boy, we used to make what we termed hedgehogs. We used to get a potato and stick matches in the potato all the way around it, so that it looked like a hedgehog. Well, this is how the Penelope looked when the men had finished, filling up all these holes with wood. They christened her then the Pepper Pot Penelope, and that name stuck to that boat right until it was finally sent to the breaker's yard years later. The Pepper Pot Penelope. Do you know, that boat limped home to Britain, was repaired, refitted, and back into the fray once more. Now, another very important boat came into the Grand Harbour. She had been attacked, severely attacked, outside Malta, but had managed to limp into the Grand Harbour and tie up. Our old friend that we mentioned at the very beginning, the aircraft carrier Illustrious, under the command of Lord Louis Mountbatten. She had taken a hammering and had crept into the Grand Harbour for some protection. Well, the Germans attacked the Grand Harbour normally But whenever they found out the Illustrious was in, they renewed their attack. And waves of bombers came over. Well, every gun in the island, by this time we had a fair number of guns. Every gun in the island put up a barrage above the Illustrious. Now, one bomb went right down the aircraft lift. You know, the aircraft are kept under the deck, and there's a big lift which takes them from that deck up to the flight deck. Well, a bomb went right down there and exploded. And afterwards, I wasn't called to do it, but some lads from our unit were called upon to go and help clean up the mess on HMS Illustrious, or rather the aircraft carrier Illustrious. And they told us afterwards that it was indescribable, the mess aboard the aircraft carrier. However, under cover of darkness, she slipped out, made her way home, and another ship was repaired, refitted, and back into the fray again. So that was 2 ships that are called into Malta. And we were able to help them a little, but nevertheless help them. Every day seemed alike to us. Firing guns all day, every day, cleaning the guns in the short lulls that we had between waves of bombers, firing guns again. And, as I said, our food was running short. So much so that about this time they started rationing. Well, we didn't have an awful lot to eat, but the poor Maltese people had even less. And I remember being out one day when an old lady with a small girl beside her came up to my friend and myself and said, "Sergeant, I will give you £1 for one small piece of bread to give the baby." Now, £1 was an awful lot of money in those days. I think my week's wages amounted to just over £1. So there she was, offering a week's wages for one small piece of bread to give the little girl. I remember another incident, just to let you see how hungry these poor people were. We were in one site, and we were right beside a road. Only a small wall separated us from the road. Now, our rations weren't high, but nevertheless we were assured of a certain amount of food each day. And we used to get tins of corned beef, as you would know it. Bully beef, we used to call it. Now, to make this a bit more appetizing, if you could call it that, our cook used to mix the bully beef up with water, stir it all round, and make a sort of stew. Well, I remember one night a poor man passing, and we had just finished our meal of bully beef stew, when he asked us with tears in his eyes, "Please, have you any food you could give me to take home to my babies?" And our cook said, "Well, there is some stew here, if you will take that." "Oh, yes, I will take it. Thank you, I will take it." But he didn't have anything to carry it in. But he found something. Would you believe? He poured that stew into a sandbag, which wasn't particularly clean, and of course all the liquid content run out, and he went away really pleased at having some food to take home to his babies. I've never seen anybody so pleased to get anything, to get so little. And so one day followed another day and another day and so on. Every day seemed to be the same. However, Malta wasn't the only place on earth. I mean, things were happening elsewhere. In North Africa, the Eighth Army were no longer being pushed back. Instead, they were pushing, and the Germans were retreating. So that the further they were pushed back, the longer became their lines of communication, etc., and the fewer raids on Malta. Mind you, they still come in twice, 3 times a day, but not 4 and 5 times a day, as they had been doing for so long. And ships were beginning to arrive in Malta under cover of darkness. Oh yes, we had 1 or 2 armed merchantmen, as we call them. The Welshmen and the Manxmen were 2 in particular. Very fast ships, merchant ships, which used to leave Britain with food for Malta. And they used to travel as fast as they possibly could, time their arrival to arrive in Malta in the early part of the night. We worked frantically all night to have them unloaded so that they could be slipped away in the cold light of the morning back to Britain with all possible speed and load up again. So that slowly but surely our food became that little bit more plentiful, and the raids began to decrease, and more aircraft started to arrive. The bombers started to arrive, and instead of being on the defensive all the time, as we had been for about a couple of years, Malta went on to the offensive. In other words, we started to send out bombers. We started to bomb the Germans, and they did not like it one bit. And also at this time, our troops in Europe were pushing the Germans back, so that Jerry was getting pushed back everywhere. And Malta did its fair share in the bombing. In fact, the bombers arrived more and more frequently. We had more and more bombing attacks, and in fact we eventually got the Americans arriving with their huge bombers. And instead of the sky above Malta being filled with German aircraft, something we had been used to seeing for so long, they were filled with British and American aircraft going out on bombing missions. And from then onwards, from about that time onwards, we never saw another German aircraft over Malta. Now, the Maltese people had suffered an awful lot. I mean, thousands and thousands of homes had been destroyed. People were living in these caves. Babies were born and brought up in these caves. They'd never known any other home other than these caves. But now they began to emerge into the sunlight. Their daily life was picked up again, and things began to be, well, as near normal as possible. And in recognition of their bravery, the people of Malta, collectively, were rewarded by the king with a George Cross. Now, the George Cross is the highest civilian medal that can be won. It is the equivalent to the civilians that the Victoria Cross is to the Army. It is the highest medal that a civilian can win. So that the people of Malta were given or were awarded a George Cross. And hence the name Malta GC. That became the new name for Malta. Malta GC, George Cross. Malta, the George Cross Island. Now, as you probably all know, the Germans were eventually pushed out of North Africa altogether. And our soldiers, the 8th Army, the Desert Rats as they were called, crossed over, stopped off at Malta for a few days to replenish their kit, have a few days rest, and then over to Sicily. They chased the Germans out of Sicily. They chased the Germans right up Italy. And of course at the same time, our troops in Europe were pushing the Germans until eventually in 1945 the Germans said, look, we've had enough, and signed the armistice. In other words, they admitted defeat. It would take somebody more eloquent than me to describe the hardships suffered by the people of Malta. I don't know how many homes were destroyed. I do know that the Germans seemed to concentrate on the churches of Malta. The Maltese people are in themselves a very, very religious people, with big churches in every little village. No matter how small the village, it had a big church. The Germans seemed to concentrate on the churches, knowing that by destroying the churches it would really hurt the Maltese people. And they destroyed dozens of churches. Malta boasted one of the finest opera houses in Europe, the Opera House. I remember the day I was on leave with another two of the lads. We just got into Malta, into Valletta, when the air raid sirens went. Leading into Malta is an archway, Port Real, an Italian name, Port Real. We had just got to the Port Real, and fortunately just there was the entrance to one of these caves I mentioned earlier, and of course this was used as an air raid shelter. Well, we just got to this doorway when this bomb came down, and we knew we were well used to bombs by this time. We knew by the sound of it was going to be very, very close. So we just made the doorway and got in. Just got inside the doorway when this bomb went off. In fact, I think it blew us into the doorway. Well, when things quietened, we came out. 50 yards further along had been, and I say had been, the Opera House. It was just a ruin, blown to smithereens. So, as I say, they lost ever so many of their homes, thousands of homes, almost all their churches, their opera house. They lost all the things of beauty that had taken a lifetime, and more than a lifetime, to build. Within a couple of years, they were all lost. My 4-year stay in Malta was an experience which now I'm glad I had. I mean, we had bombs, we had more bombs, we had gunfire, but we also had our pleasant moments and our funny incidents too. I remember soon after we arrived in Malta, the winter in Malta is not cold, snowy as we know winter here. It is more wet and than cold. It's a bit colder than it is obviously in the summertime, but not really cold as we know it. However, about the month of November, we changed from our KD, that was our light shirts and shorts, into our battle dresses. I mean, you know the battle dress that the soldiers wear. Now, as I had said earlier, we were conscripts. We were conscripts in a regular unit when we first arrived. There was only the 4 of us, 4 conscripts, in a regular unit. Now, we had our battle dresses, but these regular soldiers had never seen a battle dress. They had what they termed the square tunic. You know, the tunic with all the brass buttons up the front and the peak cap. This is what they wore. They'd never seen a battle dress. Now, when November came round, the first November we were in Malta, we changed into our winter clothing. In my case, into battle dress. In the case of the regular soldiers, they changed into their square tunics and peak caps. Now, I was a bombardier, a corporal, at that time. And it was the duty of the corporal on duty to march the sick parade, the people who were sick, down to the medical officer down in the village, which was about 1 mile away. Now, I was resplendent in my battle dress, and I think we had about 4 lads who were going sick, going to see the MO, the medical officer. So the 5 of us set off for the village. I didn't realise at the time that not only had the regular soldiers never seen a battle dress, the Maltese had never seen one. So that when we got to the outskirts of the village, some children, some wee boys, saw us coming. And I didn't know enough Maltese at that time to know what they were shouting, but they fell in behind us, and they were joined by more children and adults. And until one of the boys on the sick parade, one of the lads who was going sick, he laughed. He said, "Of course you know what they're saying, Bombardier, don't you?" I said, "No." He says, "They think you're a German prisoner, and we are taking you to prison, and this is why they're following along behind, to see you being put into prison." We had another funny experience one time. We were not always on the same gun site all the time. We got changed around. And we were on one gun site just outside a village. In fact, it was the gun site where the fellow had come along and had taken the stew away in a sandbag. It was only 4 guns and the instruments and nothing else. Our billets were down in the village about half a mile away. And what we used to do, we used to come up at 8 o'clock in the morning and man the guns and stay there until 6 o'clock in the evening, when we were finished for the day and went back to our billets. Now this was great for us. No night duty. We just had from 8 o'clock in the morning until 6 in the evening, and then we were finished. Oh, this was great. Now, we used to have our breakfast before we left our billets in the morning, and we had our dinner when we went back in the evening. But our lunch was brought up to us at noon. We had a Maltese driver with a small horse and a cart, and he used to bring our food up, our food, sandwiches and tea. Well, one day he was coming up, as usual, with our food, when there was a raid, and a bomb dropped near to him,